Welcome to Grace to Stand. We are glad to be back with you. It's been a while since we've podcasted together. It's been a busy season in life. I'm glad to be back with my good friend, Pastor George Sayor, and I am Darin Stone. Good to have you with us today. And we are doing a podcast today on podcasting.
Like it's a coffee table book about coffee tables.
Right, exactly. This is what they call like a meta-narrative. You know, you're talking about what it is that you're doing instead of doing it or whatever. At any rate, we're doing a podcast on podcasting today. And really, what is the value of pastors or churches, for instance, having their podcast? Why it is that we're doing what we're doing? Because we think that it is helpful for the church to understand sort of the thought process that goes into the reason why we're having this in the first place, and what the benefits are for the church, for the benefits are for not only our local churches, which is our fundamental and primary audience, but also to whoever else may listen. But George, when we initially sat down and talked about this, I think that we met for breakfast. And we met for breakfast, I don't know, 7:30 or 8 in the morning. We left at almost noon. We were almost ready to order lunch again.
If it was a buffet, we'd have gotten 2 meals out of the deal.
That's right. That's what we should have gone to a buffet. But we were just talking about a whole host of issues. And this was not the first time we'd done so. We talked about a whole bunch of issues in the church and in the denomination and in all sorts, and in the world. And, you know, we thought together, maybe it would be a helpful thing to do if we took these discussions that we're having across the table at breakfast or lunch and turned them into a podcast. Not that we're, you know, the most brilliant, high-minded, godly, best pastors on the face of the earth, but maybe there's something that we could offer to the church. So, George, what is some of your take on that? Why do you think that we're doing what we're doing, and how do you see this as something that's valuable to your congregation?
Yeah, well, there's lots of reasons, and I do think it's a good conversation because, I mean, podcasting, I don't know when it came out, but it might be 20 years old in this kind of a format. I remember listening to sermons in the early 2000s from people. I don't know that we called them podcasts, but this idea of like listening to conversations or discussions or even just monologues in this kind of a format is fairly new as it regards to like apps and phones and the internet, you know. But ever since there's been electronic media, there's been this. People have had radio programs and radio shows and call-in shows and discussions, and people, you know, like the platform is proven, or the model is proven, or the format. That's what I'm looking for. The format has been proven for 50 years or more, definitely more. But it just changes. Now it's on an internet. Now it's on our phones. And, you know, I was reminded recently by some elders, like the 2 pastors or 3 pastors before me here used to have radio programs locally. And so now that, I think at least one of them was their sermons, but, you know, it's just another vehicle or avenue for the congregation to be taught. And for me, what I really wanted to do is do it not so much as a teaching, but to be able to have nuanced conversations to help my congregation be able to think through everything from theology to culture, you know. And the way this came about for me, I had considered doing it for a few years, and it really became evident to me through COVID, when everybody was suddenly looking for ways to communicate with their congregation, because even if churches were open, I mean, we were open pretty quick, but not everybody was back, you know, and it was a way to communicate. And so I would make YouTube videos for the congregation, as would some of the other pastors here, just to give people ways to be fed, since we weren't having Wednesday night activities and whatever else. And some of them that were pastoral updates, some of them were helping them to understand decisions we were thinking through or making, and others were just straight up teaching and encouragement, and some were devotional. And I was doing that through the church's YouTube page. And as things got back to normal, and our YouTube page has a lot on it. It's got obviously weekly sermons. All our classes are on there. Other certain pastoral updates are on there. And there's just a lot there, to sift through. And so I said, man, I think a podcast would help me continue to serve my church in that way. But I always thought too, like, the church hears me do monologues all the time, right? I preach sermons. When I teach classes, I teach Wednesday nights, maybe 1/3 of the year when we have Wednesday nights, like that's rotated through. I usually don't teach Sunday school because we have great ruling elders and other pastors that do that. And, I teach Bible studies too, from time to time. So they're always hearing this kind of a thing, And I said, but what really needs to happen is I'd like them to hear conversation, and you and I were having great conversations, because that one was an anomaly, but
But
that
there
was
have
a
been
lot.
other times as well where we had similar discussions that maybe didn't last 3 hours, or 4 hours,
Right.
but
And through dialogue, like
15 minutes.
yeah. And I think, Darin, what I love about it is there is a sense by which it is for the congregation in my context, but there's also a sense that it helps me think through things pastorally and Christianly, if that's a word. But because, like, we're like, it's dialogue, right? And so I floated the idea with you, and you were like, yeah, let's do that. And it was received really well, as we started to do that. And so I think that's, now I have very specific things in mind when I'm doing this that I guess we'll get into. But, I have a local congregation, and now you have a local congregation for the last number of months. But when you started this, you were 100% a missionary to the state capitol. How did you see it being used in your own ministry as a missionary who didn't have a direct congregation that you were shepherding?
Well, there are, of course, a number of people in churches that I had connected with, where I developed relationships with, people who supported the ministry, and people that churches where I preached and have fostered a strong connection with, that have asked me a host of questions about how the church is to interface with the political sphere, and how individual Christians are to live as political citizens, or just citizens in a secular society. So what's the best way to answer that question? Of course, I answer that question individually to the best of my ability with someone after a church service, but that's not always the best time to get more deeply engaged in a question like that. And people would ask a lot of the same questions, or questions along the same lines. So the podcast gave us the opportunity to be able to address some of the questions that people are asking, or imminent questions that come up in the life of the local church. Like, what's going on right now that happened this week? What do you think about this? What does Scripture have to say about this? So on and so forth. And usually when someone asks you a question, I mean, it's like what you learn in school, right? Don't be afraid to ask a question, because chances are there are 5 other people that have the same question you have. They're just not asking it, right? Well, that's certainly the case. And so being able to receive these questions from people, and to be able to have a format to where we could answer them, and people could hear maybe a more elongated or articulate answer, where we're able to do so, like you said, not just in monologue, but in discussion with one another. I think people find that to be somewhat helpful. And there's a lot of dead time that people have, right? I mean, they're in the car, people are in the car, they're in the car rider line waiting to pick up their child from school, or they're in the car on the way to work. I am amazed. I talk to people in my congregation, other just friends of mine that I know, some people, I don't know how in the world they do it. They're listening to podcasts all the time. And they're doing their jobs, they're doing, I mean, there are people who they're doing the dishes, they're mopping the floor, they're doing laundry, and they're listening to a podcast. That's what they're doing as they're listening. As
working out. I know.
Yeah,
I know guys who run and listen. I know
right.
guys who actually when I work out, I'm listening to them.
Yeah,
it definitely, yeah, because I've heard that critique like in PCA pastor forums and stuff with guys that kind of be snarky. How do you guys have all this time to podcast? And not to me directly, but I'm just saying in general as podcasts are being shared, and I'm like, I don't know. I know a lot of people with half-hour commutes to work. I know, like you'd be driving all over the state, and you'd be listening to podcasts. You have an hour to go here, an hour to go there, and so it really does provide that avenue where people can be fed, hopefully, in our context, with grace to stand.
Listening to Taylor Swift, or we could be listening to a podcast on Taylor Swift, right?
That's right. That's right.
So it's just what's the best use of the time, and it's an I think a lot of people are asking that question. How can I redeem this 30-minute commute? And the best way to redeem that 30-minute commute is to fill myself up with some
whatever you do.
Something so you can listen to sermons, and that's good. You can listen to scripture, you can listen to books, all of that. But there's also, this is another
right. Oh yeah, people listen to books on tape,
right.
And so definitely, I love what you said, because I resonate with that, with the questions of the day. We see that in the scriptures. Paul in Romans 13 says, besides this, the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from your sleep. And this idea of knowing the times, 1 Corinthians 12 talks about, and having an understanding of the times. And I think what really when I realized the power of things like social media and podcasting, even came at the other church I was at. And I remember I had chimed in on a fairly controversial topic, politics. It was around election season, and just seeing the discord, not just in the country, but in the area we lived in, even within the church. And I just shared thoughts on Facebook, and Facebook, like sometimes people use it as a blog, it's like there's like 10 paragraphs to their post and this whole thing. And that's not what social media is for. But I made a little thing like that. And I just received so much encouragement from congregants who, felt like I gave them a voice through my thoughts and in a thoughtful way. Again, not that I'm always thoughtful, but just that I wasn't out there ranting, but I was just helping people think through things biblically and Christianly. And I said, man, what's the best avenue for that? So here I experienced the same thing. It was actually at a time, I think the first thing I had written like that was something like when Chick-fil-A stopped funding Salvation Army and started giving to some other thing, and it caused this whole stir. And I had some post about how to think through that, organizations and their giving, and I just received a lot of feedback from the congregation and elders saying, this is the kind of thing we want from our pastor. I mean, that's a direct quote. Yeah. Because you're like, there's anger, there's angst. Not all of us have time to process these things in this way. And it's good that we have a pastor that does that. And so I started my blog, which is called irreverentreverend.org, where I would do that occasionally as I had time. And then the podcast really helped us do that also. And the thing with the podcast is it might take me a few hours to write an article. Sometimes I can bang something out in 20 minutes, but sometimes it takes a couple hours. These podcasts are almost no preparation for me. I don't know what you put into it, Darin, but these are things I'm thinking about, I'm processing, I'm reading. I'm always reading as a pastor. And then I just really go into them with a basic outline that usually takes me 2 minutes to put together, if that, it's like, and the same, you may put it together, I put it together, but literally it's like, well, here's the bullet points and here's how to organize them. And honestly, I moderate meetings. I've done this for a long time. It's easy for me to come up with an outline. It's just the Lord has wired me in that way. And so the preparation is very little. And so it's basically, a few minutes before the podcast, and then however long sometimes you and I, because we could talk forever, it goes an hour, but we've always kind of wanted to be a 30-minute thing. And so literally the time commitment to this for me, most of them I don't edit. And so then you're talking about, 15 minutes to sort of set it up, to render, add the front end matter, upload it, takes time, but I don't have to sit there. So if I'm editing it, that could be another hour. But anyway, my point is, like, to answer the questions that are on people's minds, which is the point you brought up, in a way that helps them think through it, as opposed to telling them instruction, this has proved to be a very good avenue for that.
Really, I'm with you, George. I mean, there are times where we do a podcast together, and some of the topics, we need to kind of get some clarity on and figure out what it is that we really want to say. So we might put a little bit of time into it. I mean, the most I think I've ever put into really preparing for a podcast and what I was going to say is maybe an hour. And generally that's not what's happening. I mean, this, I gave a little bit of thought of it as I was, driving around in the car today on the way here, but a lot of it's been thought that I've had over the course of, my whole, for months or years even. It's not something that I've never considered. So it's something for us to be able to talk about without having to put in so much preparation that it encroaches on the other areas of ministry. But it's a benefit to the church, and a benefit to the ministry, because you and I, as pastors of local congregations, really only address our churches once a week. I mean, collectively, the whole church, in a way in which they're able to, where we're really interfacing with them. This is just another means to do so during the week. I mean, it's not, of course, as personal as face-to-face and so forth, but it's another way to do so, and it's another medium to do so. It's not the same thing as preaching. It's not the same thing as leading a Bible study. It's not the same thing as leading a Sunday school class, but it's addressing issues that I think that people are wrestling with and that desire the help to think through. And that's really what our, part of what our calling is. If your calling is to work in business, or you're caring for children, or you're working in the healthcare profession or so forth, that you're thinking about that all the time, but you're not necessarily able to devote the attention to some of the theological, pastoral, Christian living issues that we are as pastors, and that we do by virtue of our calling and our vocation. And so because we're called to do that, we're able to help the church in terms of her thinking about this, where they don't have the time or the resources to maybe really address some of those issues on their own. So I think it's just a helpful. It's a discipleship tool. You write for your blog. People have these. Going back prior to blogs, what did churches do? Well, they would sometimes send news. I remember getting like a weekly newsletter that was sent in the mail. You'd go to the post. You go to the mailbox and open it up, and you'd get that, and there'd be an article written in there. It was a way pastors did that in order to disciple their churches, to have some kind of communication with them throughout the week. So we're taking the technology that's available and hopefully redeeming that for a good purpose.
Yeah. And what's great is like the timing, right? And so, cause I often hear, well, I'd love to hear this from the pulpit, or I'd love to hear that, or, why don't we talk about XYZ? And it's like, well, we are expository preachers in the Reformed world. And so we're preaching through chapters and books, and I'm fine with deviating from sermon, from that for good reasons and stuff, but we're not going to chase every, we're not going to be whack-a-mole pastor in the pulpit. Something pops up, and
part of good preaching, and as you know, George, is deciding what you're not going to say, right?
Right.
Because when you're expositing a passage, when you're preaching, it can lead you on 500 rabbit trails that you can chase and go down, and um, all of which are legitimate things to talk about, but you can't do that in 30 minutes or 40 minutes in a sermon. And sometimes we're
Right.
able to take some of those issues that might have been addressed and to be able to address them in this format.
Well, no, that's a really good point. Like, so there might be something that I'll say in a sermon that really does need a half hour to fully flesh out. Um, there is a sense that almost anything you say in the sermon can become its own half hour discussion,
Right.
and so you can't always go down on those rabbit trails. And I would say the same thing like with the classes. So we have Sunday Bible hour classes and we have Wednesday night classes, and we teach, we've taught on 12 weeks on human sexuality from the PCA report on that, or 8 weeks on confronting injustice without compromising truth, to try to equip people in the in their spheres on how they should view cultural issues. And so like we do that, but then like where do you insert the one-off teachings? Like this becomes, this or blogging. Again, you talked about the newsletter that used to be, but this or blogging, you can do one-offs, so you and I have done series like through the Westminster Larger Catechism or through Ordinary Means of Grace. And then I think we stopped that one because there were other more pressing things. Like we're able to just shift and move to what people need to hear. And what that's become is like, so this has always been for me, I don't know, from day one, I believe so, in our Friday email to the church. I always viewed this as an arm of the ministry of the church, just under a different heading so that it doesn't get mixed in with well, first of all, it is my views and my opinions personally, as much as I can say things here that maybe I can't, maybe it wouldn't be wise to say from the pulpit or something. And there's space for that. And there's also space to explain that. But to me, it's always been in the Friday emails. And my hope was that every congregant would listen to it, because not only are we thinking through, you mentioned Taylor Swift or Alistair Begg controversies or what Christian controversies that you see that people want to polarize, and we try to deal with them with nuance in ways that are respectful and kind, but also help see like this was an error, but that doesn't mean somebody is canceled, but also then how do we think through our theology in ways that, again, we often don't have the full space to do so from the pulpit or from a class. And so now we can talk through things like, what does ordinary means of grace mean? Or why are the PCA membership vows important? And so I might, when we do members class, members vows from the front of the church, I may spend 3 minutes on that, and I may talk about it I will definitely talk about it as it comes up in sermon text. But you and I, we did 2 or 3 episodes or maybe more. I don't remember how many we did on the membership vows and the real richness to them and the beauty of them. And so my hope is always like, well, if the congregation's not listening to these things, because again, I don't believe I'm not going to be legalistic about it. You must listen to this, but I can say, well, we talked about this here, and here's the link to it. And some of them are directly linked on the website under like Q&A stuff on the website. I want to expand that. But well, here's our understanding of that. Because like you said, 2 minutes after a sermon on a Sunday is not the time to have like a nuanced conversation that gives topics the due that they, but here we can have this and point to this. And man, I've seen great fruit from it in the lives of our in the lives of my congregants. They'll talk to me about it when they see me and say, that was really good. I really appreciated how you handled this. And so it's teaching people how to think about these things, not how to think. Everybody is, they're adults. I can learn ways to think from the congregants. I do all the time. I mean, a good pastor needs to understand how the congregation thinks too. But this is teaching people how to think through cultural issues from people who studied this. I mean, this is You know,
Right.
I mean, it is our profession to some extent.
Right. And how do you lean into the grace that the Lord provides
Amen.
to his people uh, as you engage with such and such particular issue or such and such particular question? And that's really the aim of this particular podcast. Really, this is because we care about Christians in general and people in our churches in particular growing in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, not just generally speaking, but in the particulars. And it's a way in which we can help them do that we're taking advantage of in our own time. So I'm glad
Yeah.
that we're doing this together. We certainly intend to continue. And if there are topics that people are interested in hearing us discuss, that would be wonderful to hear what those might be. And that might be something that people could leave in the comments. But most of the fodder we get is what we're observing or what people in our churches are.
Well, I had, yeah, I mean, that's a good point there. And I had congregants ask me about the Alistair Begg thing because attending, an illegitimate marriage of a family member, you know? And so that would, people listened to, I had people ask us about it.
Yeah.
You and I were on top of it before that because we're like, this would be, this would be a good conversation anyway. But then I had people I had people share feedback with me, like articles. Oh, look at this. And it really was a tool of engagement with a number of people in the congregation. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't really, I'm glad people listen to the podcast outside of my sphere. And your sphere was wider than mine because you were preaching at so many different churches. You have a lot, and it goes in your newsletter and whatever. But I don't really promote it beyond our church, although I'm happy for people to listen to it beyond the church. Like that Alistair Begg one and He Gets Us one has, again, it has thousands of views on YouTube alone, let alone on iTunes or anything. I don't know who those people are. I don't know anything about that. But what I do know is any episode we've done, I'm thinking of my congregation. How can I help them know what our denomination believes or a reformed and Christian way to view XYZ or whatever, and people can disagree, Mm-hmm. Yeah. But as far as like I've always said, I don't have delusions of grandeur that, if I wanted Grace to Stand to be viral, I think we'd be talking about a lot of different things and we'd have hot takes. And I don't really think we do hot takes, you and I, meaning like this, we want this clickbait sentence in there so that people will, I can't think of one hot take I've ever said, and definitely not intentionally, but definitely not even in passing, I'm trying to be thoughtful. I don't, I know I'm a bozo a lot of the time. So, I'm not saying I'm successful in that regard, but like to the time thing, you brought up a few times, like, when I teach a Wednesday night class, I may have 4 or 5 hours into that. Mm-hmm. In study, preparation, I always have slides, so making slides takes time, handouts, and then the class itself is an hour long, And this one, we're at 30 minutes, about 30 minutes now, like this whole thing, and we do it every 2 weeks. This whole thing will have an hour worth of my time in 2 weeks to teach the congregation. Now, again, this is a podcast on podcasting, so I'm not sure we're teaching people. But I think what I know is, and you'll see this as you're gonna you're gonna be installed as senior pastor of your church. People want to know what your pastor thinks,
right?
And they want to know why they do the things they do. And so there are going to be people that will appreciate this and realize, like, from day one. And I know our conversation was, how do we help our people? Let's it's another avenue for us to teach our people or people that are interested in what we have to say in our ministries. And I've told you this repeatedly. I know my people are listening to the podcast because they love Darin. They love Darin. It's like, oh my gosh, that podcast was so great. Darin was so smart.
Oh,
So I'm like, good. If I can platform Darin, all the better.
They need. I can point them to some other podcasts where they can listen to some smart people.
Yeah.
Anyway,
what are the chances people are still listening
today? And we'll have other exciting topics to talk about over the.
What are the chances people listen to this podcast about pastors podcasting up to this point?
Wah, 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 wah.
Yes, I know. Anyway, I don't know. You could sign us off, Darin, and until next time. I'm sure we'll have something interesting to talk about.
Well, we do thank you for listening. It's a joy to do this. Good to be with you, George. And we'll be back next time. So thanks for joining us on Grace.
And I will be with you on Sunday to preach your installation sermon at your new church.
That's right.
Very excited about that.
Very excited. Thank you.
Oh boy. Welcome to local church ministry once again, my friend.